Welcome to this edition of Bibliotheca Sacra. If the Lord be for us, who can be against us? We turn now to Bibliotheca Sacra, a new article, Suicide and the Thief in John 10:10. How does the church respond to this social and theological tragedy of growing suicide? Frequently, John 10:10 is cited where Satan is understood to be the thief who comes to steal and destroy and kill. In discussing John 10:10, John Logan says of Satan, first, he wants to steal the eternal significance of your life. Second, Satan wants to kill you, but he can't do that without God's permission. So he'll tell you to do it for him. Most of the people I deal with have had serious thoughts of suicide because they're convinced it's the only way out. This demonic association with suicide becomes so dominant in some circles that other legitimate contributors to the suicidal act are not considered. Other contributors, such as serious mental illness, adverse childhood experience, traumatic brain injuries, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and loss. This careful exegesis of this passage, however, does not support identifying the thief in this fashion. The text is simply not addressing the topic of suicide at all. There's no direct reference to the issue, nor is there even a tangential implication of its presence. When the church misspeaks about suicide by isolating this verse from its context and wrongly inserting Satan into it as the thief, it increases the stigma surrounding suicide and thereby hinders appropriate suicide prevention efforts. Thus, a careful look at John 10:10 is needed to correct the wrongful application to difficult and complicated concerns. The historical background of John 10:10. The broader context of John 10:10 begins obviously in John 1, but becomes more focused in John 4. There, large crowds are following Jesus. His popularity has reached its apex. Then John 5 opens with Jesus' healing ominously on the Sabbath. Thus begins the formal opposition to Jesus' ministry by Jerusalem's religious leaders. Because of the grave nature of the opposition, Jesus leaves Jerusalem for Galilee. But then in Capernaum, many disciples decide that eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood is too hard and quit following him. John 7 begins with Jesus going about in Galilee, not wanting to return to Jerusalem because the Jews were seeking to kill him. But dramatically, the Feast of Booths was at hand. John records opposition to Christ before, during, the last day, and immediately after the feast. Since the whole of John 7 through 10 is circumscribed by this one event that takes place in Jerusalem, a brief summary of that celebration is in order as it pertains to the healing of the blind man. We turn to modern Reformation and Guy Richard's article on the need for creeds and confessions. This kind of confessional permanence gives protection to ministers and church leaders insofar as it means that the requirements for ordination are not a moving target. What is required today for church office will be required tomorrow and the next day. Church leaders can exercise their callings in confidence knowing the standards to which they are held accountable will remain the same. But it gives protection to church members as well, because it ensures the teaching they receive will not be constantly changing. The second way creeds and confessions provide protection is by limiting the authority of the church. No rogue minister or church officer can impose his will concerning any number of matters relating to Christian life, because the church's creed or confession limits what only can be imposed upon its members. The church, governed by no creed but the Bible, may respond to these kinds of situations in the same way a confessional church would. The members of that church wouldn't have the same assurances and protections going on that the confessional congregation has. The third way that confessional documents provide protection is by allowing for diversity of conviction and practice within a context in which the peace and purity of the church are preserved. Let me give an example of what I mean. When my son was first learning to walk, my wife and I lived in a house that had a staircase in the kitchen that went up to an extra room over our garage. To ensure his safety at all times, therefore, we decided to put up a gate in front of the staircase to limit his access to them. Our son had the freedom to play as he wanted in the rest of the house without fear of serious injury. The gate protected him from the areas that were most dangerous. Creeds and confessions operate the same way as that gate. They protect church members from those areas where the church has concluded it is theologically or practically dangerous for them to go, while giving them genuine freedom of conviction. Summary and conclusion. Creeds and confession promote unity, ensure peace and purity, and provide protection within the church. But they don't do this all by themselves. It is not enough for church or denomination to have a creed or confession. Traditionalism, which Jaroslav Pelikan so helpfully defined as the dead faith of the living, and formalism are ever-present realities within the church of every generation. Creeds and confessions must be embraced and wholeheartedly adopted in order to serve these three ends that we've described in this article. That is the challenge presented to every generation of Christians. We must seek to understand why the church has needed confessional documents. Then and only then will we be able to persuade others in the church to do the same. In closing, it bears mentioning that creeds and confessions have been employed to great benefit by the majority of God's people over the centuries. Only a small minority in the church have considered them unimportant. This may not be definitive proof of the necessity of creeds and confessions, but it certainly adds weight to the persuasive argument for them. For at least 1,500 years, the Church of the Lord Jesus has recognized what Samuel Miller stated so clearly at the beginning of this article. No church can hope to maintain a homogeneous character. No church can be secure either of purity and peace for a single year. Nay, no church can be effectually guard against the highest degrees of corruption and strife without some test of truth explicitly agreed upon. It is my hope and prayer that the church will be characterized by the same recognition for the next 1,500 years, all to the praise of God's glorious grace. We turn now to modern Reformation, the importance of being written scribes of the Westminster Assembly, describing two record keepers at that assembly. Of course, 3 scribes were not the only divines to jot down what happened inside Westminster Abbey and its famed Jerusalem chamber, where committee work took place. The churchman John Longfoot, one of England's learned Talmudic scholars, alongside John Selden, who was also at the assembly, kept an elegant journal into which he entered summaries of the assembly's opening months. Robert Bailey ignored rules about confidentiality by sending dispatches of assembly proceedings across Scotland and Europe. George Gillespie also took copious notes, sometimes relocating the order of speeches in his narrative, and he seems to have enjoyed doing so, writing home to Scotland to say that London was the best place on the earth. The minutes produced by the scribes offer a fuller, stranger, more remarkable account. Snapshots of impassioned debates, piercing examinations, heartfelt resolutions, hours of nettlesome discussion over many days are often condensed into a few fragmentary notes. The pace of the assembly and the toil of the scribes was exhausting. Stephen Marshall, the most frequent preacher before Parliament and most frequent speaker at the assembly, commented, "All our discourses are recorded by the scribes so far as their pens can reach them. Rarely the scribes miscounted the vote. When they did, it caused, in Lightfoot's words, a great deal of heat." Twice, Cornelius Burgess, one of the most important members of the assembly, required the scribes to improve his sensitive speeches. From their immense labors, the scribes received the same pay as other divines, although sometimes they were able to supplement their meager stipends. In 1645, for example, when the Directory for Public Worship went to print under Byfield's supervision, the proceeds were split equally among the scribes and two parliamentary houses. These minutes provide more than mere antiquarian interest. Not only do they reveal how the assembly worked, but also, and most importantly for the church then as now, they illuminate what the divines meant when discussing points of profound doctrinal import: the obedience of Christ, the eternal decree, the nature of Christian liberty, and liberty of conscience, among others. John Bower's verdict is apt. It is chiefly through the Assembly's minutes and papers, aided by other sources such as Parliament's journals and a steady stream of contemporary published works, for the Assembly's day-to-day work to create order amid civil war and ecclesiastical chaos is to be found. It is here where the history of the Confession unfolds. In antiquity, unheralded scribes copied out the scriptures. From the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, long-forgotten copyists made possible great books by scholars that are still read today. Likewise, the scribes at Westminster Assembly left behind a long and winding trail of paper, as challenging as it is rewarding to follow. We have an ideal guide to their world, the sublime 5-volume edition of the Minutes and Papers of the Westminster Assembly by Chad Van Dixhorn. When we read through it, we can become better readers of the Church's confession. For that reason, we might even fill our ministers' libraries with the MPWA to make available scholarly tools for pastoral reflection and study. A motion, perhaps, for the next committee. Finish that article, it's quite good. Now for Calvin's Theological Journal. Theological Interpretation of Key Passages pertaining to the Nigerian Prosperity Preachers. So when considered in its proper socio-historical context, the verse cannot be interpreted as a promise from God that assures divine health and wealth, talking about 3 John 2. Meanwhile, in this context, 3 John 2 is equivalent to the phrase, I hope you're doing well. Then, as a Christian, John simply adds some spiritual meat to his wish and wants Gaius' soul to prosper as well. The key word that is the focus of our exegetical attention is prosper. The word translated prosper in the KJV and go well in the NIV comes from the Greek word euodao, which is a compound of eu and meaning good, and the odos meaning route, progress, or journey. Euodao is rarely used outside the Bible and possibly not used at all before the Septuagint. In the New Testament, euodao is always used in the passive, which is figurative. The active use does not appear in the New Testament. Euodao is used in the New Testament in its passive form and figuratively to mean be on a good path, succeed, go well, succeed in business. Pick that up in our next go around. Westminster Theological Journal, R.B. Jameson, on sonship. Impressively argued, theologically mature work that succeeds admirably in defending its major theses. The author understands Hebrews well and its place in the broader scope of New Testament and Christian theology. And he shows incisively why many treatments of Hebrews fail to appreciate either the ontological status of the Son or the realities of redemptive history, though James does not use the latter term. Readers of this journal will find much to appreciate in Jameson's work, especially those who are familiar with the Christological minimalism in some pockets of New Testament scholarship. While Jameson is appreciative of the scholarship he engages, there are no sacred cows, and he identifies shortcomings even in some works to which he is indebted. By way of example, though he is appreciative of Richard Bauckham's Christology of Divine Identity, he also argues that it can fail to do justice to the humanity of Christ. Further, I think Jameson is correct that Psalm 2 in Hebrews 1 is more immediately about the resurrection than about eternity per se. I find much to agree with in Jameson's work, but the spirit of sharpening the iron, I do have some reservations about some of the points, some of which deviate from traditional Reformed theology. I say this recognizing that readers will find much in this volume, and that Jameson himself stands in the Baptist tradition. First, a few passages warrant more nuanced theological language. For example, although Jameson argues that Hebrews 1:3 speaks of the full divinity of the Son, if the Son is auto theos, it is not best to say Jesus' being derives from and reproduces that of the Father. Jameson also speaks of Jesus becoming mediator at the completion of his work. This might simply refer to Christ's accomplishment of his eschatological work, though Jameson means the Son was not mediator prior to the incarnation. This would be a difference with Reformed theology, Westminster 32. Second, while Jameson is to be congratulated for the breadth of research in a relatively slim volume, there's a noticeable historical gap. He canvasses key voices of the early church well, especially Cyril of Alexandria, and he is conversant with contemporary scholarship on Hebrews and Christology. There's very little interaction with sources from the Reformation and post-Reformation era, including some 19th and 20th century voices, many of which explicitly address issues pertinent to the book's thesis. To be sure, every author must choose their conversation partners, and no one can be expected to interact with everyone. Even so, given that Jameson's thesis has been anticipated by other writers, it would have been prudent for him to engage with some of those voices. Two examples can be mentioned. Number one, the redemptive historical approach to Reformed biblical theology has long argued that Christ's exaltation is a real exaltation, and established as Lord and Son in a new sense after his resurrection. Given the role of Silva's essay for Jameson, exploring those whose work Silva builds on, such as Voss, Ritterboss, and perhaps Gaffin, would have been fitting. Number two, though it is more a minor point in the volume, Jameson insists that in Hebrews Christ is only a priest in heaven, not on earth. I remain unconvinced of this portion of Jameson's argument, not least because he has not interacted with detailed and substantive objections to this view from the post-Reformation era. If the category of Son can be both eternal and redemptive historical, then can the concept of a priest not also apply both to the estate of humiliation and exaltation? There may be fruitful ways for Jameson's work in the paradox of sonship to further inform the paradox of priesthood as well. These reservations, however, do not materially affect the author's primary argument. We need more books like this one. Pastors and graduate students will find it both useful for the clarity with which it is argued and its engagement with contemporary Hebrew scholarship, as well as for the way to make sense of the letter as a whole. Jameson's work illustrates why we need proper appreciation of redemptive history when reading biblical texts. This book will also be useful to those interested in Christology and the Church's creedal traditions, which are more biblical than many biblical scholars have assumed. We turn to Mid-American Theological Journal, Dr. Cornelius Venema, on biblical and effectual calling. Biblical and theological rationale for distinguishing between effectual calling and regeneration. Thus far, my observations regarding Van Hooser and Horton's proposal have been general and historical. The observations that I will make in this section aim to get at the heart of the matter, namely the biblical and theological rationale for distinguishing between effectual calling and regeneration. Are there biblical and theological arguments that warrant the traditional distinction? Or is it true that the distinction between regeneration, apart from the means, and effectual calling through the word is both exegetically untenable and theologically unnecessary? Many are called, but few are chosen. Perhaps the most significant problem with the proposal of Van Hooser and Horton is that it does not offer a satisfactory answer to a basic question regarding the efficacy of the gospel call. What accounts ultimately for the diverse response on the part of those who are called to union with Christ through the ministry of the Word? to express this question in the language of speech act theory. Why does the gospel locution, the word spoken, and illocution, the aim or purpose of the word spoken, have perlocutionary effect in the case of some who respond to the word of faith and repentance, but not in the case of others who respond to the word in unbelief and in penitence? If God's communicative speech is lively and powerful, effectual in achieving its intended end as a species of divine rhetoric, what accounts for the persistent resistance on the part of some recipients of the gospel word, but not others? Turn our attention to Global Anglican, another book review. This is written by Rachel Gardner, dealing with a book entitled The Sex Thing, Reimagining Conversations with Young People About Sex, by SPCK 2021. Christian youth groups have made a lot of mistakes when it goes to helping young people understand sexuality. Just telling young people what to do, or rather what not to do, has bred a hypocrisy and ultimately led to young people walking away and into less healthy ways of living. Youth culture has moved so quickly that the church often misses the place of engagement with young people. Youth groups end up preparing young people for a world we don't fully understand. This is the thesis of The Sex Thing. Rachel Gardner, best known for her role in Youthscape and Romance Academy, writes in response to these missteps and to encourage a more fruitful way forward by proposing a framework for discussing sex with young people. The book is divided into 3 parts. The first, analyses and critiques the current state of play in our churches and how we have dealt with sex. Part 2 proposes a framework based around open discussion, listening and guiding rather than telling. Part 3 gives the findings of the survey which underpins the framework. Gardner's writing is incredibly clear and helpful, seamlessly weaving in conversations with young people with references from popular culture and theologians. Not only is it well researched, but Gardner writes with striking and sometimes unnerving honesty, modeling well what she is asking young leaders to do. The framework she proposes is helpful not just for talking about sex with young people, but more generally for pastoral work. It recognizes that moral dilemmas are often complex and require careful and attentive listening. It recognizes that giving young people simplistic solutions and expecting them simply to do what they are told is naive and self-defeating. Young people have a voice and views that must be engaged with in order to help them make good decisions. A particular highlight is the chapter on desires. It seems a crucial area for youth practitioners to engage with when it comes to helping young people understand themselves. It often appears to be overlooked in much contemporary discussion of sexuality. Gardner's analysis of culture is simply brilliant in its reading of our current cultural moment. There were a couple areas of concern. First, although Gardner is clear about how she counsels same-sex attracted youth, she is also open to churches and youth workers who would take a more affirming stance. This is understandable in making the framework more widely used, but this reviewer would be less comfortable with that. Second, there is a strange moment on page 108 where Gardner claims that Jesus used the term shalom in John 14 and 20. The term is Hebrew, and the Greek may be reflecting it, but that is not made clear. However, the second point is minor. In summary, this is a superbly written and helpful book, and I would encourage all those working with young people to listen carefully to what Gardner has to say and is proposing. For too long, evangelicals have sought to engender a sexual ethic which has failed to engage the complexities that youth have to deal with. Young people have minds, hearts, and desires, and Gardner's framework engages them as people. Now for Benjamin Sargent's article on the Bishop of our souls. Another distinctive feature of 1 Peter 5, 1-4 is that it addresses the motivation and attitude of those who lead. In doing so, it reflects Jesus' response to the request of James and John in Mark 10, 42-45. Indeed, Peter also uses a participle form of the unusual verb lorded over, katakuri, yet ontis. The exhortation has a well-designed quality, particularly in the use of contrasting couplets. Shepherd the flock of God which is among you as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly as God would have you, not for personal gain, but eagerly, not exercising lordship over the portion, but being examples to the flock. Peter's interest is the motivation of the leaders. The exhortation here is to see that ministry is offered as a gift, given freely and without expectation of reward, whether through gaining wealth or power. The idea of personal gain, eis krakados, is typically understood as financial benefit achieved through unjust means. The use of this term elsewhere is overwhelmingly negative. Herodotus uses it to describe the Persian Emperor Darius's desecration of a tomb for its gold. Aristotle to describe someone who wants to make money out of his friends. Euripides to refer to Spartan desire for prosperity through betrayal. The pastoral image of the leader of God's people as a shepherd is widespread elsewhere in the Bible. Ezekiel 34, Acts 20:28. What is notable here is that the shepherd is to be an overseer. This might be unremarkable if it were not for the fact that these two elements are combined in the identity of God, 1 Peter 2:25. For you were as sheep going astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. This is no coincidence. Just as the church must represent God in the world, elders must be exemplary in their shepherd-like leadership. Peter contrasts the possible exercising of lordship over part of God's flock that elders have responsibility for, with the need to be examples to them. This is not a position of elevation, but one of visibility, transparency, and accountability. Nothing is hidden. The idea that leaders of the church are to be exemplary is well tested in the New Testament. Just as the shepherd is characterized by the sending of his son, who will suffer as a substitute for others, he is to walk and be marked by humility. Elders are to be representatives of God, but unlike Ignatius's encouragement to the church entrails, are not offered the reverence due to God alone. Peter is clear on this in his identification with the elders as fellow elder, whose glory is entirely in the future. We'll pick up one more. Dr. Nakim's article on a usable pass for a post-American nation. One can understand why some Americans have come to such a conclusion about white supremacy. After more than 2 centuries, racial equality is still far from achieved. 6 decades after the Civil Rights Movement, Black Americans are still disproportionately left behind, impoverished and incarcerated. Black Americans have been subjected to enslavement, plans for removal, Jim Crow segregation, and terrorist violence. All the talk about the city on a hill or all men being created equal can ring hollow to many of our fellow citizens. That's why, in the mind of post-Americans, we must not merely understand the history of American racism, but overcome American history altogether. This is the real significance of the journalist Nicole Hannah Jones' widely read introductory history to the 1619 Project. Hannah Jones is not just revising American history or helping us understand African American history. She is offering a new founding narrative for post-America. The entire story of America must be retold. In Hannah Jones' history, America's founding fathers fought for a nation defined not by equality and liberty, but inequality and slavery. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison were not patriots, but owners of forced labor camps. Hannah Jones rewrites a familiar plot to serve post-American needs. In the older story, colonists, after years of struggle, overthrew British tyranny. In Hannah Jones' narrative, Black people play the part of the colonists, and whites become the tyrants. Not only were the latter guilty of genocide against indigenous people, it created a nation devoted to racial domination whose victims included Africans brought here forcibly and their descendants. That Black Americans have faced violence, oppression, and discrimination in our history goes without question. So is the fact that the efforts of Black Americans to achieve equality and justice have expanded the meaning of American democracy. Yet Hannah Jones is not situating Black American struggles and stories within American history. Instead, she writes, more than any other group in this country's history, we have served generation after generation in an overlooked but vital role. It is we who have been the perfecters of democracy. In this interpretation, white people are not part of the story of American liberty. They are the problem. The story will end only when we are liberated from the regime that was established in 1776, a regime that imposed national form and order created in 1619 when enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia. Post-American historians, therefore, will need to write new founding myths for a new nation. Pick that up in our next edition. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost.